Hey guys, and welcome back to Monka, where stuff ensues, but yesterday I beat a game and I definitely want to talk about it because this game has been lurking on my mind, to be honest, for a few months since I played the original, and I definitely wanted to play this one, and I definitely have a lot of opinions about this game. But yesterday I beat Dusk Diver 2, specifically the version that came out on the Nintendo Switch. As I understand though, this game also came to PlayStation and PC via Steam. The game came out in February of 2022, is developed by Wanting, which have developed the original one. I believe in the original video I said it was developed by JFI Games. As far as I understand, I may have been false in that claim, and I believe the original was developed by Wanting as well as this game. Now, this time around they switched up the publisher because this game is actually published by Idea Factory, which is kind of wild. I won't lie, it's kind of interesting to see Idea Factory pick up on a game like this, but the game is a direct sequel to the original Dusk Diver, and in total the game took me 35 hours to beat, which is substantially longer than the original game for me. I think the original game took me around 20 hours, so this game took 15 more hours. With that said though, the game is a lot meatier and it definitely doesn't feel like it overstays its welcome. But the long and the short of my opinion on Dusk Diver 2 is that this game is an improvement over the original in every way, and just overall is just a better game than the original Dusk Diver. It kind of blows it out of the water, to be honest. The original Dusk Diver compared to Dusk Diver 2 just looks like a tech demo, and this game is just really fun, to be honest, in my opinion. But in terms of the graphics and performance, the graphics look fine on the Switch. There are some jagged edges, but if you know me, and I've said it probably at least a million times within my videos, I really don't give a shit about the graphics. I think they look comparable to the original game, if not like almost exactly the same to the original game, but they look fine for what they are. I kind of enjoy the whole Tokyo Mirage Sessions vibe that I get from it, where people at a distance are kind of silhouettes, but as you get close to them, they more develop into an actual figure. But the graphics are alright. I don't really care about graphics, so it's nothing I can bitch about. But in terms of the performance, this game actually performs substantially better than the original game did on the Switch. The only complaint I have about the performance on the Switch is the fact that it has a memory leak issue that never got patched out. That means that after playing it for about an hour or two, the frame rate definitely starts to take a hit, and if you reboot the game, this issue goes away and the frame rate returns to normal. But if you just continually play for an hour or more, or maybe 2 hours or so, the frame rate just consistently starts to drop and drop. I don't think it ever drops to a point where the game will just straight up crash. I did have 2 crashes while I was playing this game, both in the same area known as the Chaos Playland. Other than that though, the memory leak issue is the biggest issue I can say about performance. Otherwise the game runs pretty fine, but it's just the fact that after you get about hour and a half, I'd say, the frame rate starts to dip due to memory leak, which is kind of unfortunate. It kind of sucks that they never patched it out, because I think that'd be something they could patch out, but just know that as of my time playing this, which was around mid-July of 2020, there is a memory leak issue with the game on the Switch, and it never was patched out at this point. But in terms of the graphics and performance, the graphics are alright. Like I said, nothing to complain about. There's a few jagged edges if that's something you really give a shit about. And in terms of performance, it performs fine until it hits the memory leak issue about an hour and a half in. But in terms of the music and voice acting, the music in this game is actually a pretty banger, to be honest. Now, it does reuse a handful of tracks from the original game, and as well, it does remix some tracks from the original game as well. I personally really like the remix tracks in this game. Specifically, the 2 I can remember is that they remixed Reminiscing and they remixed the Tumaz mark. Both those remixes are really good and I enjoyed them. As well though, there are songs that are just straight up ripped from the original game that are just reused, but those are pretty few and far between. Other than that, the soundtrack has quite a few bangers on it. Like I said, Tumaz mark and as well Reminiscing, both are pretty banger. Of course they were already pretty banger, but some of the more chill songs and some of the battle songs as well are just really bangers all hell. The original game had a good soundtrack, albeit it sounded a bit on the budget side, but this one definitely is scaled up. I'm not sure if that's just the Idea Factory money being thrown around that it just was able to have a better soundtrack, but it definitely sounds a lot better in this game. But in terms of the soundtrack, it's actually pretty good. It has some songs from the original game, it has some songs that are remixed from the original game, it has some bangers that are new to the soundtrack, but overall the soundtrack is pretty good. Now in terms of the voice acting, pretty much all the voice actors, as far as I know, from the original game reprise their roles in Dusk Diver 2, and they all do pretty well, to be honest. I don't know what I said about them in my original opinion on Dusk Diver. Honestly, they're decent voice actors. I have no complaints about them. The new characters as well have decent voice actors, and they bring out the characters, to be honest. So I have absolutely no complaints about the voice actors at all. But in terms of music, there's actually quite a few bangers in the music, and I can appreciate that. And the voice actors, they do their part, and I can't complain about it, to be honest. But in terms of the story, heads up before I go into the this story, I will be speaking on spoilers of the original game to cover this game. So if you haven't played the original game, I wouldn't really recommend watching the story segment because I'm going to be spoiling a lot of story parts for the original game. But the story of Dusk Diver 2 takes place 1 year after the original Dusk Diver, still features the cast from the original game, and it still follows Yumo just 1 year later. So Yumo goes from being a high school girl in the original game to being a college girl in Dusk Diver 2. Yumo is still fighting in Yushanding against the Chaos Beasts as she was in the original Dusk Diver. Ever since Nemia was extracted from the system and was controlling the Chaos Beasts, Yushanding has become unstable, and so essentially they kind of do some weird shit with the story because they kind of have to add characters in that weren't in the original story but should have been in the original story. But pretty much the general of Yushanding has pretty much started creating control areas, which starts creating issues with Chaos Beasts and Yushanding, and as well starts causing problems in Zemending with people known as possessed popping up in Zemending, which are pretty much humans who are possessed by Chaos Beasts. But pretty much this progresses into a story of where another calamity has the potential to occur, and pretty much Yumo and gang are fighting to prevent this calamity. Honestly, this story is done pretty well. I'm oversimplifying it just not to spoil anything, but the story has a lot more meat on its bones than the original game did, where it pretty much was in the original game that Yumo was just fighting through Chaos Beasts to stabilize Yushanding, and eventually some depth was added in at the end. This game has a lot of depth to its story, and I can really appreciate that. Now near the end it kind of gets kind of wild, to be honest, and that kind of comfort of the story kind of goes away, but I like the story overall, and it's really aided by what we'll speak on next, which is the characters. But overall I really enjoyed the story. I feel like it's a lot deeper than the original game, and honestly it's just an enjoyable story overall. But in terms of the characters, pretty much all of the characters from the original game return. So Yuma, Yusha, Leo, Bahet, Viada, Boss, they all return, as well as Nemia, who was a character introduced at the end of the original Dusk Diver. She returns for Dusk Diver 2 as well, and all of those characters are pretty much the exact same as they were in the original game. Maybe have some depth added to them, but they're pretty much the same personalities that I remember from the original game, and that's not a problem at all because I enjoyed all these characters in the original game. So really I can't complain about those characters that are reprising their roles because they're still kind of the same goofy characters that they were in the original game, and I like them because they really help with the story, and they really help to kind of build this atmosphere for the story and really help the story as well. So I do not mind the old characters. They add quite a few new characters, making this roster of characters actually pretty large, and honestly the new characters aren't all that bad either. Now there's some forgettable ones that they add as well, but for the most part the new characters are also done pretty well. But overall, in terms of the story and characters, the story is done pretty well. It has a decent amount of meat on it in comparison to the original game, which I am fine with. And the characters, the original ones are pretty much the same, and the new ones that they add are also done pretty well as well. But in terms of the gameplay, this is the meat and potatoes of Dusk Diver, and this is actually where they change a lot of shit up, to be honest. But the gameplay of Dusk Diver 2 kind of semi-follows what they did in Dusk Diver 1, with a few changes, of course. You have the dungeon crawling parts of the game, and you also have the wandering Zemending parts of the game. Kind of similar to the original game, but definitely done in a different way. Besides Zemending, you can also explore some areas outside of Zemending. Now with that said, those areas aren't really all that huge as compared to Zemending, but you can still explore outside of Zemending in other areas as well. But the exploration of Zemending really isn't all that deep in my opinion. You'll interact with characters to obtain side quests, and as well, like in the original game, you can also eat at eateries or buy stuff at shops, but they really don't do much more in terms of Zemending exploration outside of that. They do add battles into it where you can actually run into some of the possessed characters I was talking about and initiate battle, but other than that, the exploration of Zemending is kind of the same like it was in the original. It is done a bit better though, because Zemending in this game has a lot more personality, and it is actually really cool because, like in the original game, I really appreciate the fact that the game took place in a different setting other than something like Japan, specifically Tokyo, Japan, or like Shibuya or Akihabara or some shit like that. Like, you know, the theme is kind of worn out on me, to be honest, but the game taking place in Taipei, Taiwan is really cool. Specifically, it's mostly focused on Zemending Ding, but the faithfulness to actually recreating Ding in this game is really cool, because I was actually doing research online and looking it up, and there's actually a lot of places in Ding that are in Dusk 2. So there's something known as like the Taepai Rainbow, which is like the end of a street that's painted with a rainbow and it says Taepai on it, and that's in Dusk 2. There's some place called the Red House in Ding that's also in Dusk 2. The attention to detail between Dusk 2 and the actual Ding is so cool to me that I don't know, it's just really cool to see that kind of attention to detail and love put into just the detail of an actual area in real life and actually translate into a video game. That's actually really cool, and it makes Ding, in my opinion, in this game have a lot more heart than it did in the original game, just because there's so much love put into actually putting the real Ding in Dusk 2. But other than that, the exploration isn't done up all that much deep. You'll visit some other areas outside of Ding, like I said. I complained in my original video that I wish they gave you more to do in Ding, but in this game they streamlined it a lot more to where that complaint isn't really all that present. I felt like they were attempting to have more depth in the exploration process of Ding in the original game. In this game, it's a lot more streamlined, and they really try to JRPG-ify this game in a lot of ways, which I'll explain when we get into the combat. But speaking about the combat, that is the other half of this game, as well as the dungeon crawling. Now, Ding is done up a bit different in this game. Now, of course, it returns because that's the other half of this game, is the dungeon crawling. But now the dungeon crawling is done up a bit differently in this game, as in the original game, you would pretty much run through segments or rerun segments of certain areas. In this game, the dungeon crawling is pretty much, the dungeons are a separate thing from the story, so you can replay a dungeon without having to replay a story segment. The Ding parts are just a separate part of the game that you can access at any point that you would like, and you can battle demons in Ding as well as get collectibles like clothing or dragon vein shards, or just grind out XP as well. But I do like the exploration in this game more than the original game, just because they add it in more of a dungeon format instead of having to rerun parts of the story. You actually have parts of Ding that you can just explore freely without having to worry about a story, which I like, and as well you can just battle enemies freely, which I like as well. I like that setup more than the original game where you had to rerun story segments. As well, with that said, in the original game they had the ranking system, which is pretty much stripped out of this game entirely because they take out rerunning story segments. I like that as well. It streamlines the game in a good way. Instead of that, they just have XP when you beat certain groups of enemies, because the game swapped to more of an XP system as opposed to a point system in the original game. But in terms of the battling is done up a bit differently in this game as well, because the game's focus in terms of battle is still kind of in the vein of a Warriors game, except it's stripped back a lot more. It's more focused on a beat 'em up than a Warriors game. The original game tried to throw a lot of enemies at you and just have you beat through waves of enemies. This game scales it back a whole hell of a lot and has you focusing specifically on one-on-one combat with enemies. The most amount of enemies you'll really engage with in one point is usually like 6 or so, maybe more than that, maybe a maximum of 10. But all of those enemies are a lot more substantial than just beating through like hundreds of enemies like you would in a Warriors game. But I like to focus on more one-on-one, kind of more personal combat than what was in the original game, which was fighting large waves of enemies, which kind of dragged on. But as well, in terms of the combat, it's a lot more polished than it was in the original game. Like I said, Idea Factory must have thrown around a lot of money, because this game just feels overall a lot more polished than the original game is, and just has a higher budget overall. But the combat is kind of similar in the original game in the sense that you still have abilities that you can use, and as well the characters like Leo, Bahet, and Viata you can use as assists. But in this game, it goes for a party-based system. Now you have 4 characters in total within your party, which are Yumo, Viata, Bahet, and Leo, and you can actually switch between all the characters, but as well the characters battle alongside you. This kind of changes the dynamic of battles, because really in the original game you were just fighting by yourself with them as assist characters, but in this game they actually use abilities, and you can, like I said, you can use their assists, but they actually battle alongside you, so it feels more like a party-based action RPG rather than a warrior style of game. But I really enjoyed the combat just because it felt a lot more polished, and also the sound design for the combat made the combat really satisfying just to beat the hell out of enemies. But it just feels a lot polished. At first when you start the game it feels slower than the original game, but the pace does pick up as you continue to go through the game. But I found the combat to be really enjoyable. Now in this game, D-Arms does return, which is the ultimate mode. I didn't use it a whole hell of a lot, to be honest, just because I didn't feel like using it a lot. There are some challenging battles in the game, specifically boss battles later in the game, where I did use the D-Arms, but I never really felt like using it. I feel feel like it's a lot better implemented in this game than it was in the original though. But other than the combat getting a major change as well, the gear system and as well the XP system got a major change from the original game. This game has actually changed from a points-based system to an XP-based system where you gain XP. Now the XP is kind of put into a pot where you can actually upgrade characters kind of at your discretion with the XP that you're given. So you pretty much get XP points, but they're not allocated to any particular character at any point. Instead, you allocate the XP to the characters that you want to. Pretty much this eliminates the issue of ever having characters being under level, because you can keep your characters all the same level consistently throughout the game. Now that being said, they kind of do keep the points-based system because you upgrade in terms of attributes, so you'll pretty much put XP points towards attributes like attack, defense, stamina, etc. But I like the way it's done because you can keep your characters all at the same level and you'll never have an issue of your characters being under leveled. But as well, the gear system, like I said, changed because this game is actually a loot-based game where you gain loot throughout the entirety of the game by accessing chests or beating enemies. It's kind of a weird system because the original game, as I recall, did not use a loot-based system, but this game uses a loot-based system where you upgrade your armor and shit like that through a loot-based system where you collect loot from enemies that you defeated or treasure chests. It's kind of weird, but honestly I don't mind it. I just haven't played a heavily like loot collection based RPG like this in a while, I don't think. But as well, like in the original game, or at least what I recall from the original game, the game has orbs which are kind of like materia that you can equip to your armor and stuff like that. But overall, I'd say the loot-based system and XP system are an upgrade from what we had in the original game. But other than that, the only other thing to talk about really is the length of the game, the chapters, and the side missions. Now, I did 100% this game, which is kind of wild because this is the second game in a row that I've 100%ed, which is kind of strange because I'm 100% in Mado Anomalies by doing all the side missions and as well doing all the story. And this game I did the exact same thing. I did all the story, I did all the side missions, I collected everything that I could pretty much in the game, and the game never really felt like it dragged on despite me doing all of that. It's not a hard game to 100%, honestly. You can collect all the items in Yushanding pretty easily as well as in Zemending. As long as you do it throughout the game never really feels like it drags on. But I felt like the side missions were done pretty well, to be honest. They're nothing crazy memorable in my opinion, but they're not terribly done either. They do bring back some characters from the original game for the side missions, which I can appreciate. I think there's a total of 60 side missions, so there's a decent amount of them, but they don't take too long in my opinion. But I think they're worth doing just because they're fun, to be honest, to do. But in total in this game as well, there's a total of 12 chapters, which is 8 chapters shorter than the original game. But even despite that, it took me 35 hours to beat this game as opposed to the original game taking me 20 hours to beat. Now, at no point during that 35 hours do I feel like this game drags, and that's kind of surprising, to be honest, because recently I felt like games have kind of dragged on. But honestly, I enjoyed the hell out of this game and its gameplay as well, exploring Zemending, to the point where through those 12 chapters I never really felt like the game really dragged. Now, the last dungeon maybe drags a slight amount, but other than that, this game is pretty perfectly paced, to be honest. But overall, in terms of the gameplay, I feel like gameplay is just overall a total upgrade from the original game, and I really had a lot of fun with the battling and just exploring Zemending. But overall, Dusk Diver 2 is a really good game, to be honest, and is a total upgrade from the original game. I had a hell of a lot of fun with this game, to be honest. I enjoyed the music, I enjoyed the story, I enjoyed exploring Zemending as well as battling the Chaos Beast in this game, and honestly, I just had a hell of a time with this game, to be honest. I'm glad that I decided to play it because I was kind of in the middle of pushing this game off further because I had only played Dusk Diver 6 months prior, I believe. But I'm glad that I picked it up and played because honestly, I had a hell of a lot of fun with it, and throughout my 35 hours, I enjoyed like all of it. I don't feel like the game dragged at any point, and I just had a good time with a good action RPG. But honestly, I would highly recommend playing Dusk Diver 2. With that being said, I would still recommend playing the original Dusk Diver before diving into Dusk Diver 2 just because of how intertwined these stories are. But yeah, I think Dusk Diver 2 is a really good game, and I hope there's a Dusk Diver 3. I highly doubt there will be, unfortunately, because this game didn't get a lot of reception or really anything at all in terms of eyes. This is truly a hidden gem, and it's gonna go as underrated, kind of like the original game did, because this game is even less popular than the original game. But I would highly recommend playing it. It's just a ton of fun. If you enjoyed the original game, you'll definitely enjoy this one. But thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you. Stay chill.